Hi, I'm Nancy Mahoney, and I'm here at Quilt Week, and I wanted to share a tip with you on how to make flying geese units. There's quite a few methods for making flying geese units, but I've selected 4 that I'm going to show you real quick. Now the first one is maybe the traditional way of doing them back when I started quilting, which is back a long time ago in the 80s, and we would start with 2 squares. And the larger square, in this case, I'm going to cut these at 5 1/4 inches because my units are going to finish at 2 inches by 4 inches. And the math would be you're going to take that 4-inch length and you're going to add 1 1/4 inches. I'm also going to start with 2 7/8 inch squares because the short side of that unit is 2 inches finished and I'm adding the 7/8 inch for seam allowance. So the big square is cut twice diagonally to make 4 triangles. The little one is cut in half diagonally. So I'm just going to line up my ruler from corner to corner, and I'm going to cut it in half, and I'm going to make 2 triangles. So you would start with 1 big square and 4 small squares. One of the reasons this might have fallen out of favor is because you're sewing on bias edges. So you're going to take your smaller triangle, and you're going to line it up in the corner. And then you're going to feed it into your sewing machine. So go in your sewing machine this direction. And I've used red thread so that you can see my thread and you can see my stitches. So you're just going to stitch all the way across. You can chain stitch these. It goes really quickly when you do it that way. And then you're going to press this open. You're going to press it open. You're going to take your other triangle that you cut from that square and you're going to place it over here in the other corner, get everything lined up real nice and pretty, and you're going to sew across the edge of that triangle, and you come out with a 2 1/2 by 4 1/2 inch unit, and that includes the seam allowances. Now another method using those same idea of squares, so you start out with the big 5 1/4 inch square, and you need the 4 2 7/8 inch square. But this time we're not going to cut them. We're going to draw lines. And we don't draw it on the big square. We draw lines on the reverse side or the wrong side of the little squares. And you draw it on all of the little squares. Then I like to pin them on my big square. And so I'm going to place one in this corner up here and put another one in the bottom corner so that they overlap in the center. And then you sew on both sides of the line using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you're using the marked line as a guide and you're going a 1/4 inch on each side of that marked line. Then you cut them apart to make 2 units. You're going to press those units open and you're going to put a square down here in the corner on each unit. So this time it floats off into kind of no man's land over here. So each one is done then to where you're going to pin that square in place. Again, you're going to sew on both sides of the line, and you're going to end up with 4. You're going to press this open. After you've cut them apart, you're going to cut on that line, you're going to cut on this line, and then press this last one open. And so you end up with 4 identical units. The advantage to this method is there's no waste, and you haven't sewn on any bias edges. You're working strictly with squares, and you don't have any bias edges until that's already sewn. So a lot of people like that method because it's a no-waste method. Another method that is very popular these days is you start out with rectangles and squares. So if we're going to have a 2 1/2 by 4 1/2 unit, now that includes seam allowances, that's what we cut our piece. We cut a 2 1/2 by 4 1/2 inch rectangle and 2 2 1/2 inch squares. We're going to mark a line on the wrong side of the squares. And then we're going to position the square on one end. This time we're going to sew on the line. So I've positioned it and I've sewn on the line, directly on the line. And actually, sometimes it's helpful to sew just a little bit to the corner side of that line. And when you press it, that allows for the seam allowance. So now I'm going to cut that. And so because I'm right-handed, I would turn it around this way. I've already cut it. But I would line up my ruler, adding my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I would cut it as I've done here. You're going to press this open. So let me show you. I've got one pressed open for you. Here's one pressed open. And here's my little bonus unit. That's what this little piece that I cut off. I'm going to sew these together, and I'm going to end up with a little bonus unit. And I use those for different things. Make more blocks. So now I've placed my marked square on the opposite end, and make sure that you're putting it so that the tip is up here on your other beginning one. If you were to turn it this way, you would end up with like a parallelogram. But we're doing flying geese units. So make sure that that crosses and that line goes in the correct direction. You're going to sew on the line, take your ruler, trim it, and then press it open, and you'll have the same size unit. You have a little bit more waste, but you're not dealing with bigger squares. Now, one method I really like, and it's very similar to that last method. So I'm starting out with 2.5 by 4.5 and 2.5 inch squares. I'm not marking any lines. I don't like to mark lines. So what I'm doing is I'm using a ruler. So I'm going to line this up. Let me show you the position here for using the ruler. And there's two different rulers you can use. Now I have to think about it a little bit because I want to go off in this direction. I want to cut off this corner. This ruler has lines in both directions so that you can cut this way or you can cut it in the opposite direction. So you line it up. This is a 2.5 inch square. I can find my marks here. There we go. 2.5 inch square. And you'll notice this line is going to be the sewing line. And so I'm cutting a 1/4 inch beyond that line. Cutting right out here. It's the same as if I'd marked the line. There's another ruler you can use, which is this ruler. Now you notice I don't have anything reference for lining it up. I'd have to start over on this side, on the other side of the rectangle, and then I could line up the 2.5 with the outer edges of the square and cut, but otherwise it's the same. It's just a different rulers. Any of these folded corner rulers work the same. So once I've cut it, it's going to look like, here's my units, here's my cut unit, and here's that little piece I've cut off. I'm going to sew those together, and I'm going to make a bonus unit. And on this one, I'm going to sew, place it under my presser foot, and sew from corner to corner with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I can chain piece these and run those through real quick, and I'll do them like in groups of 4, and then I sew these together to make a little break, and then I end up with all those sewn together. So once you've sewn that and you've pressed it open, like I've done here, you want to place your other square, aligning the raw edges, then use your ruler again, line up the ruler, cut along the line, cut along the edge of the ruler. You're going to have your little bonus triangle again, and your flying geese unit. And here you'd press your flying geese unit, and there it comes out. Everything's trimmed, it's square, it's the correct size. So I just find it faster to do it that way. But any one of the 4 methods works, you will accomplish the same thing. Well, thank you for joining me. I hope you appreciated my tip today, and I hope to see you at Quilt Week. Thank you again.